The arc plot is the most common story structure. So let's talk about what makes an arc plot and why it's so popular. Welcome back to Writer's Theory. I'm James Winterthorn, and I wanted to talk about plot structure and the various different types of plots that are out there through various videos that we'll create. So this will be the first of, I guess, a little mini series of videos talking about plot structure. And in this one, we're just going to start off with the most popular plot structure, that being the arc plot. So an arc plot is the most traditional of story structures. The protagonist will have a very clear goal, and there will be a series of events, a chain of cause and effect events that build up toward a crescendo and a climax of the story that end in a definitive resolution to the problem the protagonist was trying to solve. You've seen the graphic of the rising tension in an arc plot structure, where generally you have the first act and it's really low, and then the second act you have a lot of the trials and making of friends and enemies, all the way up to a final confrontation with whatever the antagonist person or force is that the protagonist must confront. And then of course you have the climax of action, and then a brief resolution at the end. Most of our favorite movies are built this way. Even if they're more subtle about it, most of them do follow this structure. And it's also the most satisfying of structures, because first we're familiar with how an arc plot structure works. It builds tension continuously, and then has at least it should have a nice catharsis at the end. So we go all the way back to Aristotle and poetics, and just what we expect from a story. We expect some kind of emotional release to happen, and that is why we have that top of the arc plot. But just what makes an arc plot what it is? Like, what are the components that we need to consider when we're building this plot? First, we have a causal chain. We have events that happen that are relevant to the protagonist trying to resolve the question in the beginning. So all the events that happen build on each other and are relevant to the story. So like you have this almost daisy chain and building of action that happens. And that is that's probably the most characteristic, or that's probably the most definitive characteristic of an arc plot, is the building of action. Another thing is you'll have an active protagonist. So we are following a character or a group of characters through a series of actions, right? They are the active force within the story. So we can see the actions they take, what are the consequences, what are the actions they then have to take, what are the consequences, all the way up to the final confrontation and climax of the story. But the protagonist is the one driving the story forward. The narrative is about the protagonist or protagonist group's experience in this story, and they're the driving force behind an arc plot. Generally, you'll see some kind of external conflict, something that has imposed itself on the character's world that needs to be resolved. Whether this is an antagonist, it's another person that there is tension and conflict with, whether or not this is the society as a whole needs to change and is putting pressure on our protagonist. Whatever there's some kind of external pressure on our protagonist or protagonist group that is preventing this change from happening, and in doing so creates conflict within the story and provides excitement and a need for change within the story. So there is generally some kind of external force that the main characters are in conflict with. Arc plots are generally linear based, meaning that we follow one flow of time throughout the story. Maybe you have a flashback thrown in here or there, but we're not trying to chunk up the events in different times to develop our narrative structure. You can get creative with this and call the story in media res, and maybe it still follows a building of action to the end. But generally, we're going to follow the linear movement of characters through the story. This is just generally more of a definition than just an outcome of the story, because most stories we see will have some kind of building of action, some kind of catharsis at the end. But in an arc plot, it's just cleaner. So we use fewer of those devices with flashbacks or just telling the story in different time frames and maybe reordering those time frames. So we don't do that as much with an arc plot. It's pretty clean front to back. And generally with an arc plot, we see that the problem that was presented in the beginning of the story that the protagonist is working to resolve has some kind of resolution. The story does close. There may be threads left over, and there may be hints of more story to tell, but the main conflict does reach some kind of resolution, whether that's a good outcome for the protagonist or a tragic one. There is some kind of resolution to the question asked in the very beginning of the story. So we generally have a closed ending and a very satisfying end to the story in an arc plot. And those are the general features of the plot. I'm not going to share examples, and I also don't want to infringe on any trademarks out there about what specific plot points are. We can follow Poetics and Aristotle for beginning, middle, and end. We can look at Campbell's work for the various stages of what a protagonist goes through. But ultimately, we have a series of events, rising action. We get to the top of the action, and then we have some kind of resolution. This works for us. We like this structure. Whether or not it's when we analyze our preferences as writers and as consumers of story, we might say we like a box frame story more, or we like the in media res, or whatever plot structure that comes to mind. We might like that more, but we tend to understand the arc plot structure more naturally because it's what we consume in most stories. So it has a comfort level that we know. It also tends to be a little more satisfying at the end because of the climax in action. This also is just incredibly flexible. So we can do this across almost any genre, not just adventure-based stories, but almost any story we tell, we can apply this structure to and have it be reliably good for us. It will achieve our aims more times than not, regardless of the type of story we're telling. I mean, I would bet that if you looked at 90% of the stories, maybe even more than that, that it follows some kind of introduction of a protagonist, a need for change, the character fighting the forces that prevent that change, there being action, consequence, all the way up to a climactic scene, and then a little follow-up at the end. I bet you will see that in 90% or more of stories that we consume, including our most popular stories. Like we look at the Harry Potter series, and every book in that series follows that same pattern. And the series as a whole follows that same pattern, just a continuous building of tension. Star Wars, very similar action there. Both of those are fantasy and adventure. But we look at Pride and Prejudice. We have a very similar plot structure there. So it is pervasive, but that's not bad. It's not bad that we follow this plot structure and we know it so well. It's part of our storytelling language that we share with each other. And when we do something different, it shocks us a little bit, and not everybody will appreciate something that looks drastically different than what we're used to. Some of us nerds really appreciate it, but we do love a good arc plot. So if you're not sure how to craft an arc plot, you have a story idea, or you get stuck writing in your story, you're not sure where to take this thing next. Here's some tips for your own arc plot construction. So make sure at the beginning of your story, or at least very near the beginning, maybe like the second, third chapter-ish, that you have a good idea what your protagonist's goal is. What is your main character or main character group? What are they trying to accomplish? And write that down, and then let that inform your storytelling beyond the beginning. Wherever you get stuck in the plot, like what are they trying to achieve, and what in this moment do they need to do to make progress toward that accomplishment? The next tip I have is, I share this frequently. This is something that I kind of learned the hard way in workshopping back in school. And that is, every scene that you have in your story should service the main narrative. Now you can have subplots, things like that. That's fine. But keep it to the point. Keep it focused for what you're trying to accomplish, and have that action continue to rise. Have the tension continue to build. Even if you're taking a brief reprieve from action-heavy sequence, we still need each scene to be relevant to the story. And if you find that you're describing the world a little too much, or you're too involved in a side character's feelings, whatever it might be taking away from your main drive of resolving that big issue, consider whether that needs to be included or not, and have those scenes that you are going to include drive your narrative forward. In addition to that, last tip I'll have is keep the stakes high. If you followed my series on Ghosts Horizon, where I wrote a book here on YouTube, I got about halfway through that story, maybe a little bit less than half, and something awful happened. And I got bored writing the story. And that is a terrible place to be, because if you're bored writing it, your reader is bored reading it. And what I needed to do was raise the stakes. I needed to make the story more exciting. I needed to put more on the line for my main characters. So this is important in an arc plot, to keep the scenes relevant, to keep the stakes high, to keep what's on the line important. Because what are we doing this for? And if your characters don't achieve their goal, what would be the result of that? What would be lost? What would not be gained? So you need to keep the stakes high and keep the pressure on. And as you build up toward the ending scene, you will have more of a payoff as a result. And speaking of that payoff, you do want it to have some kind of major resolution. When we look at Aristotle, we're talking about ending stories with either a revelation or a reversal, right? So reversal can be the end wasn't what we expected it to be. not everything is as it seems, or a revelation in that the characters have discovered something important that allows them to overcome their problems. So before I wrap this up, I just want to say thanks for watching this video. If you are interested in more writing related content, or you want to follow my writing journey here on YouTube, well, please like and subscribe. I try to put out videos every week and try to provide good value for viewers here. So wrapping up arc plot, the best way to think about this is that it's a good plot structure. It's very common, sure, and maybe we want to experiment a little bit with our stories. But if we understand that most readers and most consumers of story expect something similar to this, we know that it's okay to write in this fashion. It provides a very linear experience for us and for our readers. It allows for a great emotional payoff at the end. And it's understood. We know what this is as writers and readers, and we do appreciate it, even if we say we don't sometimes. So I'm curious about your experiences with plot structure in general and using arc plot. So let me know what your experiences have been. What are your preferences, despite what I say here? I'd really like to know, so please leave a comment for me below. And with that, I will plan out the next plot video here for this series, and I will see you there. Thanks so much.